They arrived in America expecting to be broken by brutality and hunger, convinced the entire continent was a hostile cage. But what the German prisoners found in the sun-drenched vineyards of Napa Valley was an enemy so confident it used abundance and dignity, not chains, to win the ultimate moral war. The dust settled. After 4 days inside a boxcar, the prisoners emerged to the light and the scent of fermenting grapes. In 1944, Hans Richter's journey across America descended into the nightmare promised by propaganda. He was taught the United States was a hell where Germans would be starved. As the truck doors were pulled back, Hans braced for the crack of rifle butts. Instead, the only sound was the low buzz of insects and a windmill. He blinked. The air was warm. He saw not a fortress, but a vast valley. Vineyards stretched in endless rows, reaching toward a brilliant, cloudless sky. This was Napa Valley, untouched by war, where the only conflict was the struggle with the vine. The men climbed out, faces pale beneath the dust. Their reception did not match the crime of their nation. An American lieutenant stood near a sign, chewing caramel. Beside him stood a man in a wide-brimmed hat, Mr. Alistair. "Welcome, boys," the lieutenant said, his voice slow and casual, utterly lacking the sharp, militaristic edge Hans had known his entire adult life. "You're here to work." Hans watched, mind reeling. Soldiers carried rifles, but they were not pointed. There was no barbed wire, only the distant movement of farm dogs. He looked at Mr. Alistair, expecting malice or coldness. Instead, the rancher simply nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He pointed to barracks, clean, simple, and more substantial than any camp Hans had known. "First thing," Mr. Alistair said, his accent thick and unfamiliar, "we'll get you fed. You can't harvest grapes on an empty stomach." The word fed struck Hans. Propaganda promised starvation. Here he stood, offered food by the nation he had been trained to fight to the end. As he looked at the perfect rows of dormant vines, Hans felt the carefully constructed shell of his conviction crack. Everything he had been taught about America was a lie, and the truth, whatever it was utterly bewildering. Captivity of his mind was beginning. Tomorrow, they would learn what work meant in God's own country. The first command given to Hans was an invitation to eat. In the new mess hall, a long table was set with metal trays. The air was thick with coffee and sizzling fats. Hans stood frozen at the doorway, stomach twisting with fear, a reaction born of ingrained instruction. The Reich had been clear. American captivity meant systematic degradation. Every broadcast had described the enemy as barbarians, who would subject their German captives to deliberate starvation and slow torment. They would use food as a weapon, a cruel taunt before sending the prisoners to labor. Yet, the scene before him made no sense. Instead, cooks were piling trays high, fresh bread, fried potatoes, generous portions of canned meat, and bright orange California oranges. Hans's fellow prisoners shuffled forward hesitantly, their eyes darting between the food and the handful of American soldiers who watched them with mild curiosity. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clatter of silverware. The men were waiting for the trick, waiting for the shout or the realization that the meal was spoiled. One artilleryman, Franz, whispered, "It must be a test." He thought of the grim soup, thin rations, and the constant ache of deficiency. This sheer abundance felt hostile, unnatural. He pushed the plate away, convinced it would cause him great physical harm. Then, one of the cooks walked over. She pointed to the plate, gestured for eat. Seeing Hans's tray, she added apple butter to his bread. She smiled, a simple, non-malicious smile, and walked away. The kindness was more unnerving than any threat. It was the first crack in the psychological wall built by years of propaganda. Slowly, Franz reached out and took a small piece of potato. He chewed, waiting. Nothing happened. No illness, just the taste of real salt and fat. Then, one by one, the other men began to eat, first quickly and fearfully, then with relief. Hans watched them. He knew, with absolute clarity, that if this were part of some American trick, it was a trick of a scale that defied German logic. He was looking at an enemy so confident and logistically powerful, it could afford to feed its captives better than his own army fed its fighting men. It was the first undeniable proof that his nation had lied to him. He reached for the bread. It was soft, comforting, and tasted of absolute mercy. The Americans were operating on a different set of rules. This unexpected dignity was more potent than any chain. As he chewed, Hans realized the true gravity of their situation. They were being captured not by cruelty, but by kindness. The threat of suffering was removed, replaced by the dangerous threat of ideological unraveling. He finished the meal, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The next morning would bring labor, but the greatest fight had already begun, and it was taking place inside his own mind. The shock wasn't the food, but the guards. For days after their arrival, Hans and the others waited for the iron fist to appear, for the strict rules and shouted regulations that defined captivity. Yet, the camp at Alistair Vineyards operated on a logic that was profoundly unsettling in its casualness. Their warden was not a colonel, but Mr. Alistair, and their prison walls were trusted. Mr. Alistair treated them as a labor force. He explained the schedule and output. His expectations were simple: hard work during the day and adherence to the simple rules. Any violation meant confinement, but the boundaries were set by the vastness of the land itself. Mr. Alistair knew that if a prisoner tried to flee into this landscape, they would quickly perish from exposure or be found within hours. The silent land was a far more effective jailer than any soldier. This pragmatic approach was the core of America's prisoner management. By 1944, the United States was holding over 400,000 Axis prisoners. Instead of wasting valuable military manpower, the government saw an opportunity. These men filled the labor gap left by millions of American men serving overseas. The logic was efficient. A well-fed prisoner was a compliant prisoner. That defied the prisoner's expectations. Hans and his comrades were given tools, shovels, hoes, and thick leather gloves. They were assigned tasks in the vineyards and orchards requiring movement and distance. Hans often worked with 2 or 3 other Germans, sometimes out of sight of the nearest overseer. In Europe, such a scenario would have been unthinkable. Here, it was simply the reality of farm work. The American guard, Tommy, would lean against the fence post, cleaning his rifle, not watching with malice, but with boredom. Hans snapped the handle of a hoe. He braced for an outburst. Instead, Tommy simply shrugged, ambled over, and handed him a replacement from the truck. "Watch yourself, partner," was all he said. The word partner struck Hans with strange force. It dawned on Hans that the Americans were relying on dignity. They knew that a man given honest work and respect was less likely to cause than an animal. It was a massive, confident bet on human nature, one that contradicted the Nazi ideology. That quiet, unshakable confidence felt far more powerful than the screaming threats of any propaganda minister. The Americans had used the Geneva Conventions and agricultural needs to create a system both cheap and disorienting. Hans looked across the rows of vines, realizing the irony. He was sent as a fighter, but was being dismantled by a farming schedule and the courtesy of his warden, Mr. Alistair. The true test of their loyalty would begin when they performed the most profound labor, the grape harvest itself. The rhythm of the vine demanded total effort. For Hans, the grape harvest was a shock. Having spent years in military service, they were accustomed to drills, marching, and terrifying chaos. But the work was a relentless, quiet marathon of physical exertion. Their bodies screamed. Every morning, they were handed shears and baskets and sent into the rows of trellises. They bent, sweated, and worked until the muscles burned with an unfamiliar ache. Hans discovered the weight of a ripe cluster, the sticky juice, and the earthy smell of fermentation. His job was to find Zinfandel grapes, cut them cleanly without damaging the vine. It was a precise, meticulous process, demanding concentration and respect for the living product. This work created an internal change. Hans had spent years devoted to destruction, shooting down planes, maintaining weapons. Every cluster he cut, destined for the table or the bottle. It was productive labor that provided a strange sense of peace. The exhaustion was a fulfilling weariness, not anxious fatigue. The shared suffering of the labor also bridged the gap. They were German soldiers, but out in the rows, they were just men struggling against the same heat and tough vines. Franz, the artilleryman, would often help Hans lift a heavy basket, not out of military duty, but out of necessity. Their conversations were no longer about the Reich, but about the quality of the soil. Mr. Alistair, the foreman, rarely shouted. He led by example, working alongside them, his face weathered with dirt and sweat. He corrected their mistakes gently. His authority was built on knowledge and shared effort, a stark contrast to the authority of fear that had governed their lives. Hans watched the flow of the harvest, realizing how different this world was. In Germany, labor was treated as a grim duty. Here, it seemed to be a source of pride and pragmatic satisfaction. The Americans worked hard, but they joked, they sang, and they knew the output of their labor would result in abundance. By the time the sun dipped behind the western hills, Hans would gather his tools. The vines had demanded everything of his body, but in return, they had given him a profound gift, the simple dignity of honest work. The physical exhaustion was a shield, protecting him from the anxious fear and lies that still haunted his mind. That night, sleeping soundly, he dreamed not of it of the silent, perfect geometry of the vineyard rows. The true depth of that unexpected abundance was yet to be revealed in the mess hall. The powerful weapon was the dinner plate, piled high with food. For Hans, the trip to the mess hall became less about sustenance and more about contradiction. Hans's prisoners consumed 3,200 calories a day. This ration was higher than that received by most civilians still subject to rationing, and it was an insulting bounty compared to grim reality. Hans could not stop thinking about his mother, surviving on scarce potato rations in Stuttgart. The sheer volume of the food was what stunned them. There was white flour bread, thick slices of beef, not stretched into stews. There were eggs, sugar, and the startling, unlimited flow of coffee, strong enough to jolt the soul. To German prisoners used to sacrifice and scarcity, this was not just a meal, it was an incomprehensible display of industrial abundance. Hans watched a cook scrape mashed potatoes into the refuse bin. The act was so wasteful by European standards that it made Hans physically recoil. It was a profound symbol of America's unchecked material power. He whispered the observation to Franz. This abundance forced Hans to confront the propaganda. The Reich had painted America as a hollow nation of greedy factory slaves. Yet here was evidence of a system so efficient, so organized, that it fed its enemies dignity, while simultaneously building the war machine that was their nation. Power, Hans realized, was the strength of logistics. Everything ran on a precise, unceasing flow. The Americans were demonstrating, through bacon and coffee, the superiority of their economic system. They didn't need to starve their captives to prove they had won. Their victory was built into the quality of the prisoners' diet. The result of this exposure to plenty was the softening of resolve. When the body is fed, the mind has the luxury to question. The gnawing hunger that might have fueled hatred was replaced by satiety that fostered doubt. The Americans treated them as worthy of rations because they performed worthy work. It was a kind of pragmatic mercy that measured human worth by effort, not by flag. Sitting in the mess hall, finishing apple pie, Hans realized the ultimate irony. The enemy was feeding him better than his own nation ever had. The American system was not cruel. It was overwhelming. He knew then that the stories he would eventually take home would be disbelieved by those still suffering under the ruins of the war. That reality, the knowledge of the lie and the reality of the feast, was a silent, powerful poison to the ideology he once held. The food had stripped away his hatred, leaving only a difficult truth. He was a prisoner, but he was treated like a man. Hatred built by propaganda required a gift to crumble. It was Saturday night, and the washing and writing letters concluded. Hans and his comrades gathered outside the barracks. The air was silent. Suddenly, a battered pickup truck rattled up. It was Mr. Alistair, the vineyard owner, and he wasn't alone. 2 ranch hands were with him. The men stopped talking, eyes wide with suspicion. What was the meaning of this intrusion? Mr. Alistair, unfazed by their silence, gave a grin. "Thought you boys might like some music," he drawled. The ranch hands set up the phonograph and placed a record on the turntable. A scratchy sound filled the air. It was a melody unlike anything Hans had heard. It was jazz. Music the Reich had condemned as degenerate and forbidden. Hans felt a pull toward the pulsing, intricate sound. It was the music of the enemy, yet it was alive and joyous. As the record finished, one of the ranch hands, Jesse, pulled out a harmonica. He sat on the porch steps and played a slow, mournful tune, instantly recognizable across all conflict. It was Lily Marlene, the heartbreakingly popular song sung in trenches across Europe. The melody acted like a shockwave. The difference between the Americans and the Germans vanished. Jesse played the tune perfectly, sharing the universal grief contained within the song. The prisoners began to hum, then to sing German lyrics, their voices blending. Mr. Alistair stood quietly, watching the scene with a satisfied expression. The music ended, leaving a silence far deeper than before. Hans felt tears sting his eyes. He felt exposed. After a few moments, Mr. Alistair walked toward Hans, pulling a plain, corked bottle from a sack. It was not expensive, but a rough, local wine. He handed it to Hans. "You worked hard this week," he said. "This is from the farm. Share it." This simple act was the true turning point. In giving them wine, Mr. Alistair was showing trust and acknowledging them as fellow participants in the land's bounty. Hans looked over the silent rows of vines shimmering under the moonlight. The vastness of the valley, the sweetness of the music, and the simple gift converged into an overwhelming epiphany. He whispered to Franz, "Look at what they share. This confidence, it is Gottes eigenes Land." This delivery of the payoff is the emotional crescendo of the narrative. Hans realized his ultimate allegiance was shifting toward the simple, enduring humanity he found in the valley. The war was still raging, but the battle for his soul had just been quietly won. The devastation arrived in a trembling piece of paper. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners corresponded with families, though letters were heavily censored. The arrival of mail was a rare, solemn event, bringing agonizing hope and sorrow. When Hans Richter was handed a letter from his mother, his hands shook from sheer dread. He retreated to the barracks to read it. The first few lines were standard, carefully selected phrases meant to pass the censor. But then, the desperation bled through the chosen words. She wrote of the long nights and the terrible noises that shook the ground, referencing the relentless Allied bombing raids that were systematically reducing Stuttgart to ash and rubble. She did not mention bombs, but she spoke of sleeping in the cold earth and the crushing fear that the next morning would bring a telegram announcing the passing of a friend or neighbor. Hans read the letter, sitting on his bunk, staring at the small cluster of grapes he had saved. The dissonance and feeling of betrayal must be emphasized here. The contrast was a physical blow. Outside, the valley was a riot of life. Inside the letter, his home was immense destruction and fear. He, the soldier, was safe and surrounded by beauty, while his mother was scrambling for shelter, starving, and risking physical harm every night. The shame was a bitter taste. He was a survivor, having escaped the collapse of civilization only to witness the unstoppable power he had been taught to hate. This dissonance stripped away his loyalty. Hans realized that the propaganda was not wrong. It was a betrayal. The Reich had promised dominion, but had delivered ruin, hoarding resources and condemning the enemy who now fed its captured soldiers. He looked at the vast, effortless abundance of the Napa Valley and understood the scale of his nation's delusion. Hans looked at the letter and knew, with cold certainty, that when he wrote back, his stories of full plates and quiet work would be disbelieved by those still suffering under the ruins. They would believe the propaganda of deprivation over the reality of abundance. He was becoming an unreliable narrator, a man whose truth was too strange. His fellow prisoners shared the silent grief. They were safe, but their minds were ravaged by the realization they were harvesting God's own country grapes, while homes were sown with destruction. That evening, Hans went to bed feeling the weight of the letter, a tangible reminder that the war was nearing its conclusion, and soon they would have to face the ruins they had been so lucky to escape. The world changed not with a thunderous announcement, but with the crackle of a radio. It was May of 1945. The prisoners were scattered across the vineyards, their minds heavy with rumors that had been swirling. The radio in Mr. Alistair's office was the connection to the Reich. Hans was kneeling between the rows, tying a vine, when the foreman's son came running, his face pale. He stopped, struggling, and pointed back toward the house. Mr. Alistair stood on the porch, head bowed toward the small wooden box. The men dropped tools and walked in stunned groups toward the farmhouse. The radio broadcast was tiny and official, stating that the German High Command had formally surrendered to the Allied powers. Victory in Europe Day. The was over. For a long moment, there was no sound but the high-pitched whine of the radio and the steady, indifferent breeze rushing through the vines. There was no cheering, no shouting. Hans looked at his fellow prisoners. There was no joy, only a sudden wave of grief mixed with relief. They had been fighting for years, and now it was gone, leaving behind a vacuum and ashes. Franz wept, not tears of despair, but tears of exhaustion, the profound release of a nightmare finally concluding. Hans felt a familiar hollowness. He was safe, but his entire world had been irrevocably destroyed. Mr. Alistair finally turned off the radio. He looked at the men and spoke quietly, his voice heavy. "Well, boys," he said, using the casual address. "That's it." He paused, then turned to the vineyard. "It changes nothing for today, though. The vines still need working. Go on back." This final, pragmatic command was the truest compassion Hans had witnessed. Mr. Alistair did not offer a celebration. He offered a routine. He offered the simple, grounding necessity of work. He allowed them to grieve not by dwelling on failure, but by tending to reality. The prisoners turned and walked back to their rows, the work feeling like a shield. They continued to prune, to weed, and to tie, finding sanctuary in the physical demands. The beautiful work of bringing life from the earth continued, providing dignity. This hard-earned peace would soon lead to the agonizing choice of homecoming. The U.S. Army trucks returned, carrying the finality of freedom and the demand of homecoming. The week following Victory in Europe Day was strange. The POWs continued work, waiting to repatriate. When the trucks arrived, they were met with the agony of farewell. Hans packed his meager belongings, his uniform, letters, and the gloves he had used. These items were small, but they represented the life during the peace he had found in God's own country. The atmosphere on the vineyards was farmhands saying goodbye. The men assigned to guard them stood leaning against their trucks. The invisible barrier dissolved, replaced by courtesy of men who shared the harvest. As Hans strapped his canvas bag onto the truck bed, Mr. Alistair approached him. The vineyard owner wore his dusty denim and wide-brimmed hat. He didn't offer a handshake, but instead pulled a small, dark object from his pocket. It was a corked, unlabeled bottle of wine, a bottle of Zinfandel Hans had helped pick last season. "For your mama," Mr. Alistair said simply. "Tell her it's the best California has to offer. Tell her you helped grow it." Hans took the bottle, his throat tight with emotion. It was an act of profound validation. It confirmed that his work here had mattered, that he was leaving as a person who contributed, not just as a prisoner. "Thank you, Mr. Alistair," Hans managed to say, using the best English he had learned. "For everything." Mr. Alistair clapped him gently on the shoulder. "You earned your keep, son. That's all any of us can do." As the German prisoners climbed into the trucks, they turned for a last look at the valley. The orderly rows of vines, the sturdy barracks, the gentle mountains, all shimmered in the afternoon sun. It was a scene of perfect grace built on the certainty of American logistics and decency. Hans realized he was leaving a life of moral clarity. The moment the trucks rolled out, the reality of their destination struck them. They were leaving abundance for deprivation, peace for the ruins of a defeated homeland. Hans cradled the wine bottle in his lap. This gift of Zinfandel is a liquid promise of life from the land, being sent back to the ruins. He had come to America filled with a cynical fear of the monster. He left holding the proof of a different kind of power. The power of a nation that was so confident it did not need to crush the dignity of its enemy. As the Napa Valley disappeared, Hans whispered the phrase that had come to define his captivity. Gottes eigenes Land. He didn't know what lay ahead, But he knew the man who was leaving was fundamentally changed. He was returning to Germany not as a soldier of the Reich, but as an ambassador of an impossible truth. The journey home was brutal, a cold, gray passage that replaced California's warmth with defeat. It was early 1946 when Hans stepped off the troop ship in Bremerhaven. The air was frigid, the dockyards were a ruin, and his homeland was a landscape of rubble and hunger. He was dressed in his POW uniform, carrying his papers, gloves, and Zinfandel wine. When Hans found his way back to the outskirts of Stuttgart, what he discovered was worse than his mother's censored letters implied. His childhood home was little more than a pile of bricks, and his mother was living in a damp basement, rationing small lumps of dried potato. She rushed toward him, weeping with grief, clutching his thin, American-fed body. In the days that followed, the true, final test began: the necessity of telling the unbelievable truth. His mother and the neighbors spoke of Americans as occupiers, demanding harsh reparations. When Hans tried to tell them of the endless food, the clean barracks, and the peaceful work in the vineyards, they looked at him with pitying disbelief. "You were ill, my son," his mother whispered, convinced the experience had left him there. "The Americans are wealthy, but they are cold. They would never treat an enemy with such generosity." Hans had to become an ambassador for a reality too strange for the defeated to comprehend. He used his small bottle of wine as evidence, showing them the dark liquid pressed from the grapes of God's own country. He used his vocabulary to communicate with the incoming Allied occupation officers. His rough, farm-trained English quickly got him noticed, and he was offered work as a translator for reconstruction efforts. This work placed him squarely on the bridge between two cultures. American officers were astonished to hear his tales of the Napa Valley and the respect shown by the ranch owners. They had expected stories of hardship, not tales of abundant meals and shared music. Hans, standing in the ruins of his former life, became a testament to the pragmatic decency of the American system. His message was simple: the enemy is not a monster. He told his story to suspicious Germans, former soldiers, and bewildered Allied forces. He explained that America had defeated them not through might, but through a superior moral confidence that allowed them to treat their captives as men worthy of dignity. He argued that the American system was built on a foundation of respect for work and life, principles that Germany itself desperately needed to reclaim. Hans Richter never forgot the sunny rows of the Alistair Vineyards. In time, he opened a small agricultural supply business in the rebuilt Stuttgart, often sending letters across the sea to Mr. Alistair. His life's work became dedicated to the quiet, slow process of reconciliation, building trust one truth at a time. The powerful memory of the place he called Gottes eigenes Land was his compass. Hans had set out to fight for his nation, but found that his greatest contribution was made in the quiet, profound act of telling the truth about its enemy. The vineyard had harvested more than grapes. It had harvested a new kind of peace. The greatest victory is not won with weapons, but is earned in the simple, enduring grace of human respect. The true lesson Hans Richter carried home wasn't about military defeat, but about the quiet power of human dignity in the face of conflict. If this incredible story of the Napa Valley harvest surprised you, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable story from the past.